and namaste to everyone present. My name is Brian T. Shaw. I'm a proud member of Unchained and was released from prison on September 22nd after serving 17 and a half years. Prior to my journey, I attended Syracuse University but was unable to finish. Throughout my journey, I acquired not only a bachelor's degree in social studies, but also a master's degree in professional studies. My BA was from Bard College, and my master's degree was from the New York Theological Seminary. Forever remorseful, I am now trying to traverse this maze, which is parole, while in pursuit of reacclimating as best I can. I'm just trying to find what my path may or may not be. Again, thank you to you all present. Allow me to now pass it off to Kenyatta.
Okay, and I will also answer my CLE poll, like I know everybody else should be answering the CLE poll. So now that that is done, good morning, everyone. Appreciate y'all joining us bright and early. It is not even 10 o'clock in your time in Minnesota. My name is Kenyatta Muzzanni, and I'm the Director of Organizing with the Katal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice. We are a community-based organization that is no cream, no sugar, devoted to building power. That is it, straight Black. So we develop leadership across New York and Connecticut, where we are headquartered, and that's where I am located today in Connecticut. So really excited to join all of you and have this really good discussion about less is more and just share some things that we've learned. So I'll pass the mic over to our member, Anthony.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Maund. I'm a member of Katal. I've been a member for almost 2.5 years. I'm formerly incarcerated. I've been working on less is more when it first started in New York. Before parole was a much different place where people were getting incarcerated too much for small technical parole violations like curfew, substance use, and it was tearing families apart more than anything, and it did nothing to help public safety at all. During that time, there was around 35,000 people incarcerated just for parole technical violations. It was costing the state of New York around $680 million a year to incarcerate people for low offenses like curfew violations. These are just missing a meeting with parole officer, having a substance use disorder, and also being mentally ill. I was incarcerated shortly after. I was incarcerated for a technical violation shortly after I was released, and I also received about 22 months in that incarceration. So what it did was it tore apart my family again. It really hurt my son. It hurt my mother. It hurt a lot of people in my family to see me reincarcerated. When I was incarcerated, I did a lot of work on myself with my substance use disorder. I got an education, and then I came out and I joined Katal, and I really enjoyed doing this work. It's been a blessing, and it's kept me out of a lot of trouble. It's also important to point out that along with my violation, other people who were, the Black and brown community was suffering even worse than I was. In New York State, Blacks were 5 times more likely to be incarcerated for a technical violation than their white counterparts. And Hispanics were up to 30 times likely to be violated on their parole rather than white counterparts. So there was an element of racism in the state. And since the less is more has been passed, it has been amazing for everybody. There's been about 13,000 people released off of parole, and plenty of people that got out of jail. Over, I think, 5,000 people got just released out of jail and back to their families. it's important to keep our families together. That's how we will succeed. That's how our communities will become safer. And I think I pass it on.
Yeah, thank you for giving that historical context to what the parole system in New York looked like. And so later on in the panel discussion, we'll also repeat some of these numbers and give some updated numbers about the number of people who have been discharged from parole and the number of people who have been released from jails and prisons across New York. And we'll go through some other facts and figures. So don't worry if you may have missed some of what Anthony shared as he gave like the historical context. Something that I also wanted to add with what Anthony was naming about 35,000 people who were on parole prior to less is more. On any typical day, there were roughly 4,300 people that were incarcerated in state prisons for these technical violations. So that's 4,300 people on average every single day. And in the local jails, there were roughly 1,700 people who were detained, waiting hearings for their alleged technical violations. And so that state number accounted for roughly 10% of the state's total jail and prison population. So what we found in New York is that parole violations and these technical parole violations were a massive driver of mass incarceration. So while Anthony gave the historical context of what parole was like prior to less is more, I'll go through how we ended up forming the coalition and campaign that ended up becoming the Less is More New York campaign. So think back to what Anthony was naming about where New York was. So this was roughly 2018. Our partners over at the Columbia Justice Lab ended up doing a report on drivers of mass incarceration in New York State, and they found that technical parole violations were a major driver of mass incarceration. And so yes, we will go through what is a technical violation. We also have some time later to do that, but just to share now, a technical violation is a non-criminal violation of parole. So it is something like missing a curfew, or like what Anthony named earlier, testing positive for drugs or any other alcohol. Those are considered technical violations. And there are a few others, but those are some of the ones that we like to point out, because if you live in a state like New York, there isn't adequate transportation if you're upstate in many places. And so if a person is trying to get to a parole hearing, they may end up being 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late, and that could constitute, prior to less is more, a technical violation that would result in jail time that could be any exorbitant amount of jail time. And so we do have a section for Q&A, but I love like folks just posting in the chat. So yeah, thank you so much, Kelly, for the question. Feel free to just chime in the chat if something, you have a question for something, we might be able to answer it in real time. If we don't answer it in real time, we'll definitely get to it later during the Q&A, or use the reaction features, or do anything that if something moves you and you want to point it out, feel free to use the chat. We appreciate that. So just going back to where we were with learning about what is the main driver. So again, our partners over at the Columbia Justice Lab wrote this report on one of the drivers of mass incarceration, and they found that technical parole violations were driving mass incarceration both at the state level and at the city level. It's also going to be critically important to name that our Less is More New York campaign was also born out of the movement to close Rikers Island. So I don't even think I need to go into what is happening on Rikers Island, but we're all adults here. The island is terrible, it is deplorable, it is a shithole, and it is killing people. People are dying actively on Rikers Island. So we found that technical violations were also a main driver of people being on Rikers Island, and we knew that this would be one way to just, close Rikers Island, but also reduce these major issues of people just being incarcerated. And like Anthony pointed out, it is also a racial justice thing. The racial disparities are incredibly stark when it came to how people of color, Black people, Latinx people, Latinx folks were impacted by this. So we began the bill drafting process in 2018, worked with our champions in the State Assembly and the State Senate, that's what we call it in New York, and introduced the bill that December. And so it was important for us because both Katal and Unchained, as you heard in our introductions, were community-based organizations, were member-driven organizations. Us drafting this bill had to absolutely include the voices of people who are on parole, because that makes sense. You cannot do something for someone without having people who are at the table and driving the work that we're doing. So this included Emily's partner and co-founder of Unchained, Derek, as well as our other members and allies in the field. And so we began drafting the bill, making sure that we were including the voices of people who were impacted by incarceration. So that we did over the course of 2018 going into 2019. And so we started to form a statewide campaign. This was critical because, again, our organizations are both community-based organizations, but community organizing is our principal method of social change. One of the iron rules of community organizing is you don't do for others what they can do for themselves. I bring that into this because as we started to build a statewide campaign, we made sure to include the voices of community groups that were in the criminal justice reform field and or had been impacted by mass incarceration in some way, shape, or form. That is also important because we don't want to just ignores the massive amounts of the population who are also impacted by these issues, who may not see criminal justice reform as like their sole lane, but are still actively impacted. So we started to build this statewide campaign and coalition with groups that were signed on from groups, I say, as far as Brooklyn to Binghamton, Brooklyn to Buffalo, every corner. Some of those groups included some of the typical criminal justice reform groups that you would think of in New York, like the Fortune Society, the Osborne Association. I know these groups may not be relevant to any of you, but I'm just naming them as examples. But then they also included some groups that were not in the typical criminal justice reform field, like the Raging Grannies, who I mention at every panel discussion we do, because they are a bunch of grandmothers in New York City who just want to fight for social change, and they just get out and make noise and they join us. We also included a number of different groups like activist groups and advocacy groups and arts groups. One of our groups that I love to mention all the time is Spoken Feather. There are communications and arts groups that do storytelling, but they signed on because their co-founders are also impacted by parole. So we started to build this statewide coalition, and across the entire time that we ran the Less is More New York campaign, which is 4 years, we ended up building it to over 300 groups. These groups, local groups, statewide groups, and even a few national groups who have signed on to the Less is More New York coalition. That was important for us because it showed the breadth of how deeply needed this was for New York. Now, those 300 groups that signed on to the campaign, those weren't the only groups who signed on. We ended up reaching out to local elected officials and some statewide elected officials and others as well. And those included district attorneys. We had a number of district attorneys that represented more than half of the state's population, sheriffs, law enforcement officials, some who are on this call right now, which is why I'm mentioning this, and a whole host of others. So we had law enforcement groups, and some of those DAs that we actually and sheriffs that we actually got to sign on were quite conservative. And one would think that off the top of the head that they may not be interested in something like less is more, but they were. It's because they recognized how smart less is more was and how necessary less is more is for people. And so they signed on to the campaign, and it created a situation where we had 300 groups and a ton of other elected officials, district attorneys, sheriffs, other law enforcement agencies and groups signed on. And it became this like unique coalition of so many different groups and individuals who all recognize the necessity to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated and make sure that people who are on parole don't have to be subjected to a fear of incarceration just for a minor technical parole violation. So I love elephants. And so to discuss the biggest elephant in the room, there was a thing that happened in 2020 that impacted us significantly. That thing was COVID-19, which we are still living in, which is partially why we are in these little Zoom boxes. So as COVID-19 took over, and some of the normal things that we would do, like do lobby days at the state capitol or do in-person info sessions, as COVID-19 impacted our world, we had to adjust for the pandemic. And so we changed up some of our strategies, and we started to shift our practices to include more online events and actions that people could take, as well as doing in-person actions when it was safe to do so. So we moved our in-person info sessions that we would normally do in church basements, in libraries, in offices for community groups and reentry groups. We shifted those to being virtual. House parties that we would do, which we would do in person with community, we shifted also to virtual, and we had an action component. Whereas we would do lobby days and go and talk to lawmakers, we held we held phone zaps and days of action, where we would get on these little Zoom boxes and we would spend an entire afternoon calling lawmakers on the phone. And we'd have dozens of people on these calls who, in the span of an hour and a half, could make hundreds of calls. there were certain times where we'd have lawmakers pick up the phone and say, we know you're with less is more. We're going to sign on to the bill. We know it, and just hang up. Everyone can attest to this, like from our team who's on here. But we shifted a lot of our strategy to adapt for the COVID-19 pandemic and to make sure that we were inclusive of, that we were including everyone. Whereas some people may not have been able to go to Albany, they could pick up the phone and make phone calls from their bedroom. So we were able to hit more people and just continue to spread less is more, even during this really detrimental time as we were in the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't know what was happening. So like I said, when we could get together, we would. So we would then get together and hold in-person actions. And something that we did, and this is where I'll start to get to the end of my pieces. In 2019, shifting into 2020, we also built and developed a working group. Our Less is More New York working group, depending on the time of the year, met fairly regularly twice a week. And then as we got deeper into the legislative session, once a week. And this working group was composed of those 300 plus groups that we named, that I named earlier in this work, and they were groups that wanted to take more action with us. So we created this working group in different organizations that could take action with us both virtually and in person when we were able to do so. And so the working group is still active into this day, and I won't go into that because my colleagues will do so a little later in the panel discussion. But we created this working group so we could keep people engaged, we could get folks together collectively to take action, and so that we wouldn't lose any momentum while we were going through a very difficult year for all of us just across the globe. So we use this multi-pronged approach of doing community organizing and finding these different tactics. Our working group also included researchers and lawyers, so litigators, public defenders, reentry groups. So we were able to pull upon their expertise and their ways and use this multi-pronged strategy to get our public defenders activated and writing letters of support, to getting our reentry groups animated and holding info sessions and house parties with some of their members, to get our other groups involved, holding some campaign meetings. I can't tell you how many Zoom meetings I have been on for Less is More, where folks were just like calling lawmakers or even faxing lawmakers. Like, who's faxing in 2022? The Less is More New York campaign. That's wow, who's faxing? So we found and used these different strategies to really let lawmakers know that this was hurting our communities and that something absolutely needed to be done. So fast forward, so now we're still in the early days of the pandemic, and 2021 is coming to a close of the legislative session. In New York, our legislature runs from January to June. That's when it's really active. And so we're getting to the last week of June, and miraculously, and I say miraculously, but it was blood, sweat, and tears for over 4 years, our bill passed out of the legislature on June 10th of 2021. So it passed both the Assembly and the Senate. And then we started a difficult process for many obvious reasons I won't go into too long, but the governor of New York there was some switches, there was a scandal, governor had stepped down. So we had a new governor and a new lieutenant governor. And it was we had to change our strategy. We had worked a strategy to get Governor Cuomo to sign the bill, and then we had Governor Kathy Hochul. So we had to re-strategize and figure out what was the avenue that we were going to use to push Governor Hochul to sign Less is More. So the year started to wane, and we're getting into August. That's when the switch happened with the governors. And when September hits, the crisis on Rikers Island, remember we mentioned that earlier in the presentation, really bubbled over. At the time, I believe it was roughly 14 or 15 people had passed away on Rikers Island in early September of 2021. And there had been 2 people within a 1-week time frame. We mentioned that Less is More was critical in the closure of Rikers Island. And so the crisis, unfortunately, at Rikers Island also accelerated the need to do something. So on September 17, 2021, Governor Kathy Hochul did sign Less is More New York into law after a 4-year campaign. And during the bill signing, she actually released hundreds of people off of Rikers Island immediately who were being held for technical parole violations. And so that just emphasizes how embedded it emphasizes truly just the need to keep people safe, get people home, and also how serious the problem had begun. when the governor could immediately release hundreds of people off of a single jail. Rikers is a jail. It is not a prison. That means there were people mostly who were held pre-trial there. So now that I've talked a lot about the historical context and sort of how the Less is More New York campaign came together, I'll kick it over to you, Emily, to go through the provisions of the bill.
Awesome. Thanks, Kenyatta, and thanks, Anthony, for all of that. Thank you all for being here for this presentation. We're really excited to be sharing our experience working on what is the most transformative parole reform bill ever passed in the country. And we're very excited that there's interest in Minnesota and other places across the country in, adapting and replicating that in other states. So as Kenyatta said, I'll just walk through an overview of what the Less is More Act actually does. And I'll start at the beginning of the process, which is when someone is accused of a violation. So prior to Less is More, when a parole officer accused someone of a violation, regardless of what it was and how minor it was, that person was automatically taken to jail and detained with no opportunity for bail or release. New York State had up to 105 days to conduct the hearings for the revocation, and there was no guaranteed right to counsel until you got to your very final hearing in the process. So people were sitting in jail routinely for more than 3 months for a mere accusation of something that was not even a crime, with no opportunity to bail out or be released any other way. And then if they were found guilty of that violation, they were routinely sent back to state prison for a year or even 2 years at a time. You heard Anthony say at the beginning he was reincarcerated for 22 months for a technical violation, something that's not even a crime. So under Less is More, automatic detention has been eliminated for parole violations. For technical violations, rather than being arrested and taken to jail, people now receive a written notice of violation, and it has their court date on it, and they are expected to show up to court for their hearings, but they can remain at home with their families and in their communities while those hearings are pending. It functions essentially like an appearance ticket, right? We also enhanced due process protections for people. So people are now guaranteed the right to counsel as soon as they are notified that they've been accused of a violation, and have legal counsel throughout the hearing process. We sped up the hearing process where it used to take 105 days. It now takes 35 days if you are detained, or 55 days if you are at liberty in the community. We raised the standard of proof at all phases of the parole revocation process, because prior to Less is More, there were very low standards of proof, which meant it was very easy to find somebody guilty of the violation. And we also moved the revocation hearings out of jails and into courthouses and other community settings. Prior to Less is More, all parole revocation hearings were conducted inside local jails because everyone was automatically detained. And so that was convenient for parole officials, but was not a transparent process and was not a process where people could get support from their loved ones or even have witnesses testify on their behalf, because those people couldn't get into the jail to attend the hearings. So we really overhauled the entire violation and hearing process for people. Now, if someone is found guilty of a technical violation, under Less is More, the majority of those violations are no longer eligible for incarceration. So parole cannot send you back for most technical violations. There are a handful of technical violations that are still eligible for incarceration under less is more, but we capped the maximum penalty at 30 days of incarceration. So whereas Anthony did 22 months prior to less is more, he would never do more than 30 days now under this new scheme. And then the final component of this was a new mechanism to incentivize compliance with parole called earned time credits, or what our folks typically call it, the 30 for 30. So for every 30 days that somebody goes without a parole violation, they earn 30 days off of their supervision period. So they can essentially cut their time on parole in half by complying with their parole conditions. And this is a total paradigm shift in New York, because instead of living under constant threat of being returned to prison for doing the wrong thing, now people have that incentive where they know there's light at the end of the tunnel if they do the right thing, and they can earn their way off of parole rather than living in fear of being sent back to prison for a non-criminal mistake. So it has really transformed the way that parole operates here in New York, and transformed the experience of being on parole for people in New York. We still have work to do. This is a new law, and so there's lots of implementation challenges to make sure that it gets implemented properly. There's attacks from the opposition that we're still dealing with. You know, we've only just celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the law being signed, and it didn't fully take effect until March 1st of this year. So we are very early in the process still, but we're already seeing really tremendous results from it. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Brian, to walk us through some of that now.
Well, let's thank Kenyatta and Emily for contextualizing this conversation. There's a lot to glean from what they said, and we'll try our best to maneuver through and understand some of it. First, let's again thank Mr. Maund for having made us aware of parole system's harsh nature prior to the passage of less is more. As opposed to Mr. Maund, I no longer have to live in fear of being violated for frivolous infractions, be it technical violation. For example, being late for a curfew as a consequence of performing fatherly duties. Mr. Maund is well aware of this. Nor do I have to live in fear of being immediately reincarcerated for a set minimum time per said infraction. If I were detained, I now have the opportunity to argue my case and have it heard within a timely fashion, thus bolstering standards of proof at each stage of the violation process and guaranteeing my right to effective counsel. I can rest safely in the fact that my choice to be an active citizen, be it adhere to rules and regulations, will allow me to acclimate as I so choose. While much has changed since less is more's enactment, more work needs to be done. Let's identify a few things that have been achieved since less is more for provisions were enacted. One is that more than 800 people who were detained in local jails for alleged technical violations at the time the law was signed have been released. Approximately 600 people sent back to state prisons for technical violations have been released. 6 state prisons have been closed because of significant declines in the population. This is in part due to less is more, as well as other campaigns. Where 17,000 people were detained on any given day prior to less is more for technical violations, the daily average is now fewer than 220. That's a nearly 90% decrease. Also, as a result of retroactive earned time credits, roughly 13,000 people were discharged early from parole between March and August, reducing the parole population by nearly 40%. As Anthony mentioned earlier, in 2019, there were about 36,000 people on parole across New York State. Today, there are fewer than 20,000. Now, this is the most transformative piece of parole reform legislation ever passed in the country. And we've already seen tremendous positive impact. As I said before, though, the work is not done. We're working closely, as stated by Kenyatta and Emily, with defense attorneys and people directly impacted across the state to advocate with governor's office and legislature for proper implementation. However, the new law continues to be attacked in nuanced ways. Not only the prison system, but more importantly, parole officers union and its allies are attempting to undermine the law by lying about what it does and arguing that recidivism rates have grown in the wake of less is more's implementation. This is a claim that is premature since changes are so recent and data has not been yet released. We're working with campaign members across the state to get our narrative out there and highlight positive impact and success stories of people who have benefited from the law. Namely, our legislative session in New York runs from January to June, and we will have to fight to protect the law from rollbacks. It's important to highlight that campaigns cannot end once laws get signed. With support from funders, we have to continue to advocate for legislative change. Otherwise, our wins, less is more, will be reversed before their impact is ever fully measured and realized. Again, more work is needed as a continuation of this conference and ideas gleaned from our conversation, be it the four of us speaking, as well as all of you listening in and the conversations you're to have. After this, we look forward to further working with Minnesota and other supportive agencies to actualize less is more's 4 provisions and other de-incarceration endeavors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. Again, namaste. Allow me to now pass it back to Anthony Maund.
Yes, I gotta say that there is a ton more work to be done, and the best part of it is to come. Thankfully, we've gotten this new system, and we're trying to change our community's mind. We need to put as much emphasis on public health as we do public safety, because just like if people are not healthy, they cannot go to work, they cannot pay taxes, they cannot raise their families, they cannot, and just like somebody that's suffering the disease of addiction, they cannot work, they're not taxpayers, they're not able to contribute to their community the fullest. It is imperative that we give every human being in our community a purpose, something to live for, something to work for. And this is why this work was so important for me to get into. It is, I can't not even, anything I say would be just underdoing how I feel. And I'm really grateful to get Minnesota to come in, and I look forward to working. And anyone here can reach out to me at any time, and I will do as much work, help you guys as much to get to where we're at. And as a group, we can move forward and keep improving our system, leaving no person out, improving ourselves in every way, making our communities healthier and then safer. Thank you. I'd like to pass it back to Kenyatta.
Yeah, and I think, Emily, Brian, if this works for you both, I think we can just go right into, yep, Q&A. Thanks, Will. Just pull up the question.
Yeah, so feel free to drop questions in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and just jump into the conversation, whatever you're most comfortable with. We have until 10 of for this session, so we have about 20 minutes for questions. At about quarter of, another one of those CLE polls is going to pop up, so just a reminder about that.
Yeah. Emily, do you want to tackle Will's question first, especially since it's about rural areas?
Sure. So let me just take a look here, Will. Yeah. So how did we respond when probation agents, for us, we call them parole officers, especially from rural areas, argue that they do not have alternatives to incarceration to meet the needs of people on community supervision in their areas. So yeah, this has been a concern that's been raised. I will say, you know, candidly, that we oftentimes feel like this is a disingenuous concern that is raised by parole officers. But for us, it is a real concern that, you know, people coming home need resources and need support, right? And in New York, parole has never really been the agency that's connecting folks with those things. And we don't expect that to change a lot, really, as a result of less is more. But what will change significantly is we no longer have to spend $680 million a year locking people up for things that are not crimes. And we have an opportunity now to really influence where is that money going to be spent, right? That's a huge chunk of money that the state and all of its counties can reinvest in the communities that have been most harmed by mass incarceration and mass supervision across New York. And that, of course, is Black and Brown communities primarily. But even in, you know, our upstate and more rural counties, there's a lot to be reinvested in terms of not just support for people reentering, but basic infrastructure that will help our communities thrive in general, right? So Unchained and Katal are currently hosting a series of town halls in conjunction with the Columbia Justice Lab on this issue, and we're systematically collecting feedback from community members across the state on this issue of, you know, where they would like to see that money reinvested, what the needs are in their communities, and we'll be releasing a report with the Columbia Justice Lab next year, doing a fiscal analysis of how much money has been saved since the enactment of less is more, and then really amplifying the feedback that we hear from people in those town halls.
And the only additional thing I would add to that, I think Emily summed it up really, really well, and just the necessity of and highlighting how disingenuous that question is. If a probation officer or parole officer, for us with less is more, said that there was no alternative to incarceration, that just proves that incarceration is not working. And so we need to actually invest in other things rather than just continuing to lock people up. And I want to also point out here too, part of the reason why we have such a broad coalition is also so that we can work with the reentry groups and agencies that are providing some services. So we can then potentially coordinate and say, okay, so if we know Less is More New York is going to get passed, we know Fortune Society, you're going to have lighter, you know, caseloads. So are there additional, you know, services, or Osborne Society provide housing? So we're going to have people coming, you know, being discharged from parole who now still need housing. So can we coordinate something? So we're constantly in conversation with our working group members who also do this work. And so if we can be in conversation with our working group members, parole officers can also be in conversation with community groups to figure out alternative solutions. Kelly, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I had lots of questions, so I wasn't quite sure how to put it in the chat. First, I just want to thank all of you. This has been extremely helpful, and I've learned from each and every one of you. So thank you so much for spending your time with us in Minnesota today. I have questions about some of the nuts and bolts behind the bill. You know, I think one of the questions was, what's the standard of proof now? Which technical violations might still be eligible. So I don't know if there's a link to the bill somewhere, if it's in the other link that you posted in the chat, but I would love to actually see the bill language. As a policymaker here in Minnesota, that would be extremely helpful. And then also, like, how do we get in touch with you later on? So I don't know who, like, is there one point of contact that would be best for us to have to reach out later? And then I guess the question, a like specific question for now, is when I love your incentivizing compliance part of this. And do you have any worries, or are you tracking to make sure that racial disparities are eliminated with that too? I'm just curious if you're keeping track of that to make sure that the people who are benefiting from that incentivizing aren't, it's not divided based on racial disparities. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally makes sense. Kelly, we can definitely get you the bill language. I can dig up the link for it in a minute, or Kenyatta might be working on that right now, actually.
I'll drop it in the chat for you, Kelly.
Thanks. Yes, and then I'll also put my contact information in the chat, because people should feel free to follow up with me about nuts and bolts questions about the bill. And I can, you know, walk through specific questions about some of the more technical aspects of it. Yeah, so we are definitely working on tracking outcomes, and of course paying attention to racial disparities. We're continuing to partner with the Columbia Justice Lab on that. They had put out a couple of reports detailing the racial disparities prior to Less is More, and so we'll be working with them to do sort of follow-up reports, looking at, you know, what things look like post Less is More. And are also, you know, working closely with defenders' offices as well, so that they're a good source of data when there's a lag in the official reporting from state agencies. You know, sometimes it's easier to work with defender offices to try and get some of that data in the meantime. So yes, like I said, I'll put my contact info in the chat, and definitely can get into more details about stuff if you'd like. Did that touch on most of what you asked, Kelly? Okay, thank you. And so I think we can move on to Kara's question, right? I'd love to know how you were able to access the impact data that Brian highlighted in such a timely manner. Is there a public data dashboard or something similar that makes that data available? So here's a lesson learned from us, which is put some kind of data reporting requirement in the bill. We did not do that and are regretting that. So that's a big lesson learned for us. However, because we do have strong relationships with our legislators, including the chairs of the corrections committees in both chambers of the legislature, and we have a strong working relationship with the governor's office, which is who oversees parole in New York State. We've been able to get data through those channels. There is some publicly available data that comes out from the state, particularly on the local jails. on a monthly basis. So we do rely on that. And there's also some publicly available data from the parole system in terms of numbers of people on parole. And so we track that monthly as well. But most of those numbers that you heard Brian running through were numbers that we were able to get directly from the parole system through legislators and the governor's office. And I see Kenyatta saying we have a question from Kate.
Yeah, I can take on Kate's question. So Kate had asked, how do you navigate such a broad coalition with groups that are not traditionally aligned? Sorry, my facilitator hat. I'm so used to just like reading the question out, like in case people aren't looking at the chat. Bear with me and give me some grace here, y'all. So in short, how do you navigate such a broad coalition with groups that may not be traditionally aligned? Were there members of the coalition hesitant to include prosecutors and law enforcement, and what did those conversations look like? The beautiful thing I think about community organizing is that the point of us trying to, another iron rule in community organizing, you build a base that is stronger and bigger than the base you want to hold accountable. So you heard Emily mention that one of our biggest oppositions is PEF. PEF is the Public Employee Federation, and they are like the parole officers union. They have thousands of members. So how do you build a coalition that is bigger than the groups you're trying to hold accountable, which also in this instance now includes the parole system and PEF? We have to find thousands of people across the state that are bigger. So we were able to meet with a ton of different people. And something I want to also point out in community organizing doesn't mean that everyone was in the room at the same time. So we definitely would hold phone zaps, and we would hold phone zaps that would be, hey, we're going to reach out to all of our reentry groups and have a reentry phone zap for the next 3 weeks. So we'll just hit all the reentry groups. Hey, we're going to need we got a letter of support from the State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So what if we partnered with them and the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they can release a joint letter that we can then jointly release on social media. So that's one avenue that we were able to, one thing that we were able to do is like definitely connect with the groups who aligned more and do more events and actions and take actions with those groups. And then more broadly, and my colleagues, jump in if you have a different take on this, but I actually don't think we had any major opposition with groups on the coalition who were maybe traditional CJ reform groups that didn't necessarily like the sheriff or like a prosecutor or DA. I don't think we actually had that level of opposition. And if anything, I found that most of the coalition members understood that, okay, well, this may be a conservative sheriff, in Erie County, and we don't agree with them on a ton of other issues, but here's the one thing we do agree on, and we can just push forward and call for the passage of less is more. And that doesn't mean that when we're in our local community meetings, I'm still not going to go ham on you for not supporting bail reform or not supporting another piece of legislation. I think in a weird way, we were able to get folks together who aligned and do work with groups that aligned. And Emily's also pointing out in the chat another old community organizing iron rule: no permanent enemies, no permanent allies. So we got the groups who were aligned together to work on those events and actions together. And then when it was, and then we also had a separate strategy for those other groups. Something I also want to point out too, and I failed to mention it in my piece just given the time, but our message wasn't the same to each of the groups or individuals who signed on to the campaign. If we're talking to a traditional CJ reform group, they would understand the human impact. And so we could just dive into, here's how, human beings are being caged. This is how, like Anthony was sharing, it's tearing families apart. This is how, like what Brian was saying, fathers are being subjected to, harsher conditions and can't see their kids. But when we're talking to the conservative sheriff in Erie County, we're not saying that. Although those things are true, you also have to understand a self-interest. They're not going to be concerned with that. They're going to be concerned with how is this fiscally going to impact their community? How many people in their rural community are going back to incarceration for substance use? Because clearly white people are the only people that can have substance use issues. Black people are addicts and they just get thrown in jail. That's another conversation for another day. But we tried to address the self-interest of the group that we were talking with. And we had a wide array of tools in our tool belt to do that. I hope that answered the question, Kate.
I'd like to just piggyback on that a little bit. I mean, I'm in Erie County, and our sheriff, Timothy Howard, he was one rough guy to deal with for us, even in Erie County. So when he signed on, the less is more. A lot of other people signed on with him because it's like, if this guy's supporting this and he's hard on everything else, there's something got to be to this. And another thing I'd like to that's separate is a lot of the oppositions that we did come across. I think it's one of the things people got to be careful is where we get our information from. Like our recidivism numbers were added from new arrests and also parole violations. So the number was outrageously high. And when these politicians that were against it or these other groups were against it, they were giving out these misleading numbers as if they were hard fact. And all the parole violators were all on for new arrests or new crimes. And it wasn't the right picture. And so we kind of had to combat that. And we did it by bringing in factual information and trying to, like I now just said, introduce something that was going to interest every group, like whether it was the fiscal or the human or, the family cost. So everything was brought into like just put together, should I say.
So Minnesota, ball is in your court now. We're super excited. We're going to keep working with you all on it. I saw on the news and also heard from Will, you're going to be dealing with a new political climate next year. So that will change up the strategy a little bit probably. And we're excited for it. So thank you all for being here. And all of our contact information is in the chat, so grab that before you leave and feel free to reach out to any of the four of us to follow up about this.
Thank you all so much.